Well, I'm so inspired by both of you and all the things you've said that really, I thank you very much for all your words, because they're very meaningful to me. And it sort of it inspires me to go on and telling the story, because from all accounts, well, it was doing some good and hopefully a lot more in the future. So I'll start by telling you where I come from, which is Poland, a town in Poland called Piotrków, and a very pretty town where before the war I lived with my parents, my siblings, with an older brother and a younger sister. And my life was all very happy, very uneventful, because well, we didn't have all the things children have today, but we had a very happy family, lots of cousins and friends. I went to school. I did all the usual things children of that age do, but it was short-lived, because by the 1st of September, where I hadn't even reached my 9th birthday, I was still 8, war broke out and everything changed. My world turned upside down. Ours was the first town in Poland to have a ghetto. So by the 1st of November 1939, we had already been forced out of our homes into ghetto walls. And our lives changed to the extent that once within the ghetto walls, we were deprived of the most basic human rights. I won't go into every detail, except to tell you that there were 15,000 Jews in our town, but at its height, the ghetto had 28,000 in it. And the reason was that the area between my town and the German border, my town was on the west of Poland, not all that far from the German border, but that part was immediately annexed. It became part of Germany. So all the Jews had to either move out themselves, or in some cases, or if not, they're forced out, and most of them made their way or were deported into our ghetto. And the numbers grew to 28,000. Now, it was even small for the original 15,000. So the overcrowding was such that there were as many as 10 people to a room, 3 families to a room. And because of the overcrowding and the very poor sanitary conditions, a lot of epidemics broke out and people were being lost there. People are also being deported. Well, people of over the age of 12 had to wear a white armband with a blue Star of David. Anyone found without it could be shot. And school for Jewish children stopped. We had very little food. There were constant deportations, but small ones. And people, well, some people worked, others didn't. But after about 2.5 years, rumors started circulating that everybody is going to be deported except people with their work permits, and the ghetto is going to be liquidated. Now, people were in panic as of how to possibly try and save themselves. There are very few ways of doing that. And my parents were introduced to some people in another town called Częstochowa, where this man who was not only Polish, Christian, but he was of German origin. So that was a really a good find, because these people enjoyed a lot of privileges, which the average Pole didn't. And we were going to be even safer with him. I say we because this was to include my cousin, Idzia, was an only child, and my parents and her parents got together. Arrangements were made to meet this man. Everything was very secret and very dangerous and very expensive. But it all happened. He agreed to take us both one at a time. We traveled on the train with him, but it would have been too dangerous to take two Jewish girls at the same time on false papers. They were constantly stopping people and checking and looking and arresting people. So it was, the journey itself was very traumatic, and especially because there was actually a reward for handing in Jews. And some people made it into quite a lucrative business. So if anybody looked at us for more than a few seconds, we immediately thought they're suspecting us of being Jewish. They turn us over to the Gestapo, and that will be the end. But we both got there safely. We found ourselves in a house on the outskirts of Częstochowa with a middle-aged couple. This man was their son-in-law who lived around the corner with his wife and child. And these people weren't exactly pleased to have us, but they tolerated us. They didn't ill-treat us, but we were very scared and very homesick and very vulnerable. We were very aware of our situation, that we could be either betrayed or somehow something might happen where we would be arrested, and that would be the end. So we were really very frightened all the time. And we were supposed to be relatives who had come to stay from from Warsaw. And if there was a knock on the door, sometimes it was okay for us to mix. Other times we were just pushed into a cupboard or under the bed, anywhere out of sight. And I'll give you one small example when there were visitors and we were mixing, and one man started a conversation with me, and I immediately thought he's suspecting me. So he started by saying, well, I know that your relatives visiting from Warsaw. Where do you live in Warsaw? Because at that time I had never even visited Warsaw. And I was really stuck. I was sure that he was, gunning at me. But I got this idea of, I said that I just made up an address and hoped for the best. And it was fine. He didn't question it. And he was just being sociable. But our lives were such that we were in fear all the time of what is going to happen the very next minute. But my cousin, Idzia, who was an only child, was so unhappy that she asked to be taken back. She was told she can't because deportations are still going on. But she said, my friends have very good, my parents have very good friends in Piotrków who are hiding their valuables, and they'll take me in. And they said, okay. He took her back, and I thought how lucky she was. And I was still languishing there for what seemed like a lifetime. But eventually, he took me back, and there was my father waiting for us at a flour mill, which before the war belonged to him in partnership with others. Now he was lucky to have a job there. So there was my father waiting, but also my uncle, Joseph Klein, Idzia's father. Now my uncle looked at us and he went white with shock. He said, "Where's my daughter?" And the man said, "I brought her back. I took her to your friends." And he said, "No, but she's not there. Where is she? What have you done with my child?" And I still remember vividly my uncle with his hands behind his back, looking at the ground, pacing there and back, saying, "What have you done with my child?" And that's the end of the story. Nobody knows till this day what happened to Idzia. And there are sort of little side stories and how my aunt reacted to it, and how my uncle was, in any case, killed soon after that. And it was all very, very tragic. I was returned back home, to the ghetto, and now the ghetto had been reduced to just 2.5 streets. It was crowded before, but now it was 2.5 streets. And out of the 28,000 people, there were now 2,400 left, and they all had jobs. I mean, that was their reason for still being there alive. The rest had been deported. Now, when I got back, there's so many details to these stories that I need to tell you for you to really appreciate what it was like, but I haven't got the time. But when I got back, we were one of the very lucky families because we were still intact. Most people, my father, mother, and Lucia were hiding with Christian families, each with a different family. My brother Ben had a job, and that made him legal. And then I returned, and we were intact. But most families had disappeared altogether. Some, there were only perhaps 1 or 2 members left. It was a very poor, very sad sight. But as I say, we were lucky, but alas, not for long, because soon after they knew people were returning slowly, those that had not been in the deportation, not been deported, and those that were in hiding. And then they started searching for them. And my father and brother had work permit, they were away at work. Well, one day they stormed into a room where I was with my mother and Lucia and a lot of other people. They took everybody away, but they left me behind because I happened to be in bed. I wasn't ill, but it was somewhere to be. It was so crowded and the bed was empty, so I was in it. And my mother said I wasn't well. And the policeman in charge said, that's all right, she can stay. And my mother said, stay, don't go anywhere. They took them away to the synagogue, which by beautiful synagogue before the war, now dilapidated in a terrible state. They were kept there under terrible conditions without any food or water or sanitary provisions. And they were adding more people every day. They were searching and searching. And when there were 520 people, mostly women and children, and some elderly men, on the 20th of December, 1942, they were marched out at dawn in groups of 50 to the local forest called Warsaw. And there they were killed in the most horrific way. These killings were taking place all over Europe in forests. And they were carried out by the Einsatzgruppen or the 101 battalions. It's a well-known thing, and it's well documented in various books. And they died a horrible death. Again, I won't go into detail because I can't even bear to spell out what happened to them. Now, and that was on the 24th of 20th of December, just before Christmas. Now there were still 3 of us left, my father, Ben, and myself, but they were still rounding people out occasionally for whatever reason. There was so much going on. And on one occasion, they rounded up my aunt on the Heathcote side, my father's side of the family. And she was taken away screaming, who will look after my child? And by then I was the only female member of the Heathcote family left, and was down to me. Anne was 5 and I was 12. And I looked after her. After that, the ghetto was completely liquidated. And there were just 2 places which were very large concerns. One was the plywood producing very, very large place. And the other one was glassworks. And people had already been allocated to these places. Of course, we hadn't, and wasn't allocated anywhere, nor was I. We sort of didn't exist because we weren't really legal. But they knew that there's still quite a lot of people in this ghetto that they had to clear out. We were among them, and they searched every nook and cranny, and they got everybody out. I was among them, was Anne, who was standing outside the ghetto gates in a column to be deported, and lorries were arriving and we were being loaded on. I was towards the back with Anne and other people, and it was all very horrific and scary because there were all these soldiers milling around with rifles, and they would shoot people or just knock them over the head with a rifle, but as they did with a woman in front of me with a child. But it was a little bit chaotic and very, very scary. And I looked sideways. I saw there was a German officer in charge. I could see he was in charge because I knew he was a lieutenant. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. And he looked as though he was in charge, but he wasn't doing anything because he had plenty of helpers. I don't know what gave me the idea, but I actually went up to him and said that I have been separated from my father and brother. They're inside the ghetto. Could I go back to them? And he was flabbergasted. He actually had a kind face. I still remember it. And I don't know what he was thinking. I think he was slightly amused, slightly surprised. But he called over one of the policemen and said, take her back inside the ghetto. Now, on the way, I said, just a minute, I've got to get my cousin. And he said, you can't because she hasn't had permission. Now, I started arguing with him, of course, but I had this dilemma. I was faced at the age of 12 with the dilemma of, what do I do? Do I abandon my cousin and go back to my father? Do I lose that chance and stay with her? It's very difficult, actually, to explain what it feels like, because I'm sure most of you haven't experienced, and I hope you never will. But I'd like you to think about this, because the Holocaust was full of such dilemmas. And it was absolutely heartbreaking. But I carried on arguing with this policeman. And I don't know what was in his mind. Maybe he got fed up with my arguments. But he suddenly said, oh, okay, quickly, take and go back inside. And that was such an amazing bit of luck, because I know what happened to those children that were in that transport. They were there with their mothers mostly, but they were taken away from their mothers because the mothers were told that they're going to be deported to a labor camp, and they won't be able to look after their children. So if they give their children over to the powers that be, they are going to build a special children's home and they'll be safe. Now, these children today have a memorial in that same place in Krakow. There are two memorials. And there's a memorial there for these children. They were with us on that transport. So this would have been our fate had this German officer not let me go back. After that, the ghetto was liquidated. I won't go into the detail. We were allocated to the same factory as my father and brother. But of course, men and women were always housed separately in these places. So we were a long way away from one another. It was a very, very large area. But we did see one another, not every day. And at the age of 12, I started work as a slave laborer in the plywood factory. I could explain to you exactly what I did and how I did it, but of course there isn't the time. And Anne, who was so attached to me, she was terrified of losing me. but she knew she couldn't go to work with me. But because we worked shifts, there was always some women there in the barracks who would keep an eye on her. Now, life was very hard, and we all sorts of different hardships and long hours. But we weren't there all that well. We were there about 18 months when they decided to deport us. We were marched to the railway station, and men separately from women with no idea where we're going. I can tell you now that the men were deported to Buchenwald concentration camp, and I was the woman found myself in Ravensbrück concentration. Now, the first thing when we arrived, what they did was take everything away from us. It wasn't much, but they took it. Then we had to line up and give our details because, you know, the Germans were meticulous at record keeping. After that, we had to undress. Our clothing was taken away. Our heads were shaved. We went through cold communal showers. When we came out at the other end, they gave us the concentration camp garb, the striped jacket and skirt. And when we looked at one another, we could not recognize each other. It was a terrible shock to the system. We all looked exactly the same. And it is very difficult to explain what that does to one's soul. It's so to be stripped of your identity. In addition to everything else that was happening, this was like the final blow, because that it makes you give up hope, and without hope, there's no survival. And this showed itself very quickly because my aunt, Franja Klein, died soon afterwards. My best friend, Pema Blachman, died soon after. And people were just giving up. Now, some people worked in Ravensbrück, but I didn't. Well, neither did my little cousin. We were there where conditions were, I won't go into all the details. The thing that stands out there was the Appellplatz, which was like the roll call, where we had to, I thought we had to go out by 6 to be counted to stand on in the place. But someone who's writing a book about somebody else, not to do with concentration camps, but, well, it's a different aspect, but this person was in Ravensbrück. And we're discussing it, and he told me that, in fact, they had to be out by 4. Well, I didn't remember that detail, but whatever time it was in February. It was freezing cold. And we had to stand there, and they were counting and counting. Sometimes it could go on for quite a long time, 2 hours. They go off probably for coffee. They'll come back, start counting again, and perhaps a few more people had collapsed or died. And that's one of the memories. But as I said, we were only there for a short time, about 2.5 months, when they decided to deport us again. And this time after a shorter journey, because that journey to Ravensbrück took 4.5 days in cattle trucks with no food or water and terrible conditions. But this time a shorter journey, and we found ourselves in Bergen-Belsen. Now, when we arrived, it was, we got off the train, were greeted in the usual way. We heard the dogs outside barking, and we heard the clanking of the doors when they opened, and they were shouting "Raus!" And we had to jump from quite a height, and then we marched to the camp. When we reached it, there was no room for us. It was so overcrowded because there were so many other people being sent west to Germany from Poland, from the camps in Poland, from the German camps in Poland to Germany. and there was great overcrowding. But Bergen-Belsen was so overcrowded that we had to spend the night in a big tent. And this was in February, in freezing cold. Well, next morning, they actually took us into the camp. And what I remember, what's really ingrained on my mind that I'll never forget, is the sight as you entered. The first thing that hit you was the smog and the smell. And there were people there, but they were skeletons, and they were shuffling along like zombies. And they just shuffle along and collapse and die. There were lots of dead bodies around, and there were piles of bodies and piles of twisted, decaying, naked corpses. It was like something out of hell. It was horrific. And the overcrowding was such that a barrack that should have held 80 to 100 had as many as 1,000. Now, I didn't count them, but I know this from records, and this was one of the reports in a medical journal, that the overcrowding was terrible. I can't even imagine 1,000. Maybe that was a particularly large hut. But it was really shocking. Now, we were on the way to some barrack, but I heard from someone that there's a children's home somewhere in the camp. And I quickly diverted with my little cousin, and we went to find it, and we were interviewed by two women, a Dr. Bimko and Sister Luba. And after questioning us for quite a long, well, me mostly for quite a long time, one of them turned to me and said, well, we are also very overcrowded, but in any case, you are too old. I was 14 by then. And I said, okay, I understand. Will you take my cousin? And they said, yes, of course, we'll take her. But there was no way Anne was going to stay without me. She just had no intention of leaving me. And they could see. I said, well, you tell her, you know, she won't listen to me. But in the end, they relented. They took us both in. And that was another bit of luck. I know that we would not have survived on the main camp. And incidentally, people often ask me, did you see Anne Frank? Because she was there at the same time. But she died before liberation. We were liberated in April. She died in March. We arrived in February. So there was very little chance of surviving in the main camp, especially for children. But we were very lucky to get in there, and that really saved us. But even in that more protected place, where it wasn't that much better there because there was no food in the camp by then, or very little. But the fact that we were suddenly being looked after and somebody cared for us, that made such a difference. And the women who were there were very kind. But even there, I caught typhus, which was rife in the camp. And I remember lying on my upper bunk by the window. I must have come back into consciousness when I saw people running. And they weren't running very fast, but they were still running towards somewhere. I don't know where they were, I didn't know. That didn't interest me. But what interested me was how did they have the strength to run? Because, you know, when you have typhus, you're devoid of any energy, and you just can't move. And there I saw people running, and that was the 15th of May, 1945, when we were liberated by the British Army. And that's when the war finished for me. I'll just tell you very quickly, because it's very relevant, that I was still ill with typhus. I was transferred to a hospital, And after a little while, after about 3 months, I was sent to Sweden with my cousin and a lot of other children for recuperation or to stay if we wanted to. It was an amazing place. Once we got there, the Swedes were also very wonderful to us. And after that, I found out that, well, I didn't think anybody had survived, but in fact, my brother, the only other survivor of my family, had survived, and he was in England. And this is why I came to England, but only 2 years after him, in 1947. So that's my story in a nutshell, and thank you very much for listening.